afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of you around the world, and welcome to the 19th webinar of the MERLIN research project in Europe. Today, my name is Jan Senzimir. I'll be your moderator, and we'll field the questions. And we invite you at any point during this webinar to submit a question into the chat, which I will record and try to call on you or read your question in order. Today, we are very fortunate to have Wouter van de Bund from the European Joint Research Center, who will be addressing us on the subject of barrier removal in rivers with an eye toward the eventual goal of 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers. Wouter has been working on issues of lake ecology and water quality now, and has been at the Joint Research Center since 2016. The format is roughly 25 to 30, maybe as much as 35 minutes presentation, followed by a question and answer period. We will try to answer everyone's questions. There have been occasions where there have been more and questions have been answered after the webinar. Please then submit a question at any time, and I will try to keep track of it. Wouter, thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. So first, thank you very much for inviting me to give this webinar. I'm really happy to talk about the 25,000 kilometer free-flowing river target of the European Union. So to start with, restoring freshwater ecosystem, of course, that's the basic topic of the MERLIN projects, and I don't need to tell the audience here how important that is. We all know that inland waters and freshwater systems are amongst those that shows the highest rates of decline, and more than 85% of the world's wetlands have been lost, and freshwater species populations suffering an 81% decline, etc. So restoring freshwater ecosystems is really a key aspect of biodiversity policy. In the European Union, we've had quite a lot of policies on freshwater ecosystems already since several decades. This slide just shows you some of the history of that. To start with the Habitats Directive that started in 1992, that sort of gave a general framework of protecting habitats and species. And then in the year 2000, the Water Framework Directive came along specifically for rivers, lakes, and coastal waters and catchments. And that's really still the key policy framework for river basin management. And then in the first decade of this century, we got the EU regulation and also the Pan-European Action Plan for Sturgeon that were sort of specifically focusing on these important migrating fish species. And then just very recently, in 2020, we have the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which is a much more integrated way of looking at biodiversity in the European Union. And then we have the restoration law, which is actually, you can say, a part of putting this biodiversity strategy, which is basically an aspiration, you can say, into a legal framework. And you all know how difficult it has been to get this really in law, and hopefully very soon, in the next month or two, this will finally be in the part of the EU legal framework. So the EU Water Framework Directive, as I said, is really the key policy for water in Europe. And the target of that is to protect all surface waters, all groundwaters, including also the coastal and transitional waters. And this covers, it really takes a very wide integrated view, covering all pressures and all impacts. And the aim of that is really an ecological quality aim, which is an ecosystem-based approach. And the objective of this legal framework that we have is to have a good ecological status by the year 2015. Well, we're already now in 2024, so we should already have achieved it. And then what's really the key aspect of the Water Framework Directive that it is it's aimed at managing river basins, so at the catchment level, because rivers, they don't obey national boundaries and political boundaries. You really have to manage them at a scale that is relevant for the actual hydrological processes. So we have the river basin management plans that are have to be made every 6 years by all the EU member states. So as I said,
No sítio onde eles vivem. Como é que é possível até no sítio onde vivem fazer?
We were supposed to have the objective reached by 2015 already. And this shows you where we were in 2015. And as you see, we are still quite far from achieving good status everywhere. For rivers and lakes, about 40% were in good status. And at the moment, there is an analysis going on the next river basin management plan round of the year 21. And still, we are still quite far from achieving good status everywhere. So this good status objective is not really very easy. River continuity is really a very important aspect of ecological status. In theory, for the Water Framework Directive, continuity is a so-called supporting element. So it's part of ecological status as part of the hydromorphological quality elements. And good status would imply that there are no major effects of barriers and other hydromorphological pressures on the biological quality elements. In practice, however, environment objectives of the Water Framework Directive are quite difficult to achieve. And the river continuity has been identified as one of the key aspects of that is difficult to address. And one reason behind it is that the information base on barriers is quite limited. And also that the biological methods that we have, for instance, for fish, are often not very suitable for detecting the effects of continuity. And then the Water Framework Directive is in its sort of management unit is the water body, and it's quite local, while the problems of river continuity are really usually much larger at the catchment scale. So this may also limit that. So here I show you some information that we put together in a project called AMBER. The AMBER project was an EU research project a couple of years ago that tried to make an overview of all the barriers in Europe. And in this project, we put together all the available information we could find from the official data sources. And from that, we tried to estimate how many barriers we have in Europe. And it was estimated that there is about 1 million barriers in Europe, which means one barrier in every 2 river kilometers. And more than 85% of these barriers are very small, and many of these barriers are actually obsolete and not in use. And this has huge impacts on fish migration and sediment movement and hydromorphological processes. And it is this sort of realization of the ubiquity of all these barriers in Europe and the possibility to do something about it, I think that was very much also behind getting this target of 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers later on in the biodiversity strategy. So the biodiversity strategy for 2030 has been in place since 2020, so a couple of years ago. And that is a general strategy for protection of biodiversity in Europe. So the general target is to have 30% of EU land and sea protected. And freshwater ecosystems are included in that. And these objectives are actually very much sort of coinciding with those of the Water Framework Directive. So in practice, putting that into place is very much also putting the Water Framework Directive targets more in focus. But there is a specific aspect of the biodiversity on the restoration of freshwater ecosystems that is really about increased effort to restore freshwater ecosystems and the natural functions of rivers. And there is a specific target to restore at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers by the removal of obsolete barriers and also restoration of floodplains and wetlands. And it's this 25,000 kilometer target really that I want to focus here also about. The biodiversity strategy here interplays very much with existing legislation. So the biodiversity strategy calls for greater efforts to restore the ecosystems. And it really requires stepping up the efforts to reach the WFD, Water Framework Directive good status, including by removing and adjusting barriers. And then we have the 25,000 kilometer aim. And this goes beyond WFD requirements in many locations, because for the WFD, we don't require free-flowing rivers. And all this together should aim at contributing to nature protection and the restoration of ecosystems, so that by 2050, all ecosystems are restored and resilient and adequately protected. Now, the restoration law, that is really aimed at put this in a legal framework. It puts legally binding targets for nature restoration. And because many of the voluntary targets of the 2020 biodiversity strategy were not met, this is really necessary, because if you don't put it in a binding legal target, then it's very difficult to make things happen. And a reinforced approach is needed for restoration. So the restoration law has these specific restoration targets that include also the ones for river connectivity. And for the habitats, the river, lakes, alluvial, and riparian habitats are amongst those that need to be restored and need to contribute to these 30% that I was mentioning before. And so the nature restoration law then aims to achieve large-scale restoration efforts by complementing and building on the existing policy framework of the Nature Directive and the Water Framework Directive, etc., and focusing also on synergies between climate change and nature policies, and has this specific Article 7 on river connectivity. And this is about identifying and removing barriers that prevent the connectivity of surface waters. And what member states have to do then for the restoration law is make an inventory, identify barriers that need to be removed, and then according to the member state plan, setting out in the national restoration plans. And then other measures need to complement this removal of barriers. So this is going to be sort of the legal requirement in the nature restoration law. Now, when the biodiversity strategy came out, we have been trying to make a bit more guidance of what all these free-flowing river targets, what it actually means in practice. So last year, we published this guidance document. It's called Barrier Removal for River Restoration, which is now available in all the EU languages. And in this document, we provide technical guidance to help member states to identify sites, etc. And we give a definition of free-flowing rivers, and with the need to make this definition operational. And we set out the interplay of the free-flowing river target with the other legislation, and also set out a summary of financing tools to actually achieve this. So the definition that was proposed here for free-flowing rivers is based on sort of a scientific understanding. A free-flowing river is one that supports connectivity of water, sediment, nutrients, matter, and organism within the river system and with surrounding landscapes in all relevant dimensions. So vertical, temporal, lateral, and longitudinal. And it's not impaired by anthropogenic barriers and not disconnected from the floodplain where a floodplain is present. So we're not talking here about natural impediments like waterfalls and beaver dams and woody debris and things like that. It's about artificial barriers. And then when we talk about barrier removal for the biodiversity strategy, it's really the focus is on specific aspects here of river continuity. So the barriers to longitudinal and lateral connectivity of the river systems and the obsolete barriers, and not so much on temporal connectivity and vertical connectivity. So what's now ongoing is a process where we try to really make a methodology for member states, for EU member countries, to decides to make them sort of a methodology that allows them to identify whether a certain stretch of river is free-flowing or not. And this is where I would like to focus on the rest of this webinar. And this work has been carried out by a working group from with several member states, so member countries that actually have to implement this legislation, the European Environment Agency, and several parts of the European Commission and stakeholder organizations. And the mandate of this group was to develop criteria and also show the application of this criteria for free-flowing rivers. And in November last year, November 2023, we have made available this document, criteria for identifying free-flowing river stretches in the EU Biodiversity Strategy. And this is now in consultation with the member states, and is expected to be completed in the spring of this year. We're now in the middle of taking into account all the comments that we got. So the starting point here of this method is the definition that I was just mentioning of free-flowing rivers. And the audience are the member state authorities and the river basin managers and anyone who is in charge of river restoration or river restoration projects and wants to demonstrate that a certain river, a certain part of a river is free-flowing. So the scope is to answer that question: is my river stretch free-flowing? And if it's not free-flowing, what is the barrier that is actually preventing it to be free-flowing? And that can be because of barriers within the stretch, but it also is about barriers that are outside the stretch sometimes. And then you can sort of decide what to do to increase the free-flowing rivers to contribute to this 25,000 kilometer target. So to start with, we made an overview of the barrier types that we're looking at here for lateral and longitudinal connectivity. So for lateral connectivity, you're basically looking at the bank protections, so the kind of riprap kind of things that are really close to the actual river channel, and embankments that are there to prevent flooding. Those are the kind of barriers that we're looking at. For longitudinal connectivity, we have dams, weirs, sluices, crossings, and ramp and bed sills. And I mean, I'm not going to go too much into details here, but we have made sort of a systematic of barriers to look at in different situations, and also have sort of established how the different barrier types are influencing different aspects of river continuity. Then it's very important to consider the different river types. Here we made a very simple typology based on the size of the rivers, the elevation, the channel type, as you can see in this little figure, and the confinement. Those are the important aspects of river types for river continuity that we have considered here. And it's important because you cannot sort of apply the same criteria for very simple single-thread rivers from a braided or an anabranching river. So this is why we need to separate into that. And then what we agreed on is like a procedure that you can see in this cartoon on the right side, this scheme, this flow chart, that set out the process which criteria define whether a river stretch is in a free-flowing river. It consists of 4 different steps. Firstly, to identify a homogeneous river reach within a stretch that you can sort of analyze. And then for each of these homogeneous reaches, there is a separate step to evaluate whether there is problems with longitudinal connectivity and lateral connectivity, sort of at the local scale. And then there is also a step to look at the larger scale, whether there is issues with connectivity, either upstream your reach, for instance, with sediment dynamics, or downstream, for instance, with migration barriers that sort of prevent the migration of specific fish species. And then finally, there is a step that is about the minimum length assessment. So what I will do now is I will go through these 4 steps very briefly, And I will illustrate them with one case study that we put together. We have several case studies, but I chose this one, which is from the river Réverotte in France. This case is provided by Sophia Vauclin. She's working for the French ministry with a very long name, ecological transition, etc. And so the Réverotte is a small river in the Alsace region, in the Jura region, in the northeast of France. It's a small upstream river, only 12 kilometers long, and it's a single thread sinuous river, and it's partly confined. And it's a karstic environment. A part of the river is natural temporary because the water flows underground. And it's quite an interesting river for this free-flowing river story, because it has this, in France they have a certification called Rivière Sauvage, and it has this label since January 2022. So it would be an obvious candidate for a river to be free-flowing. So first, we go to the first step to identify the river reaches within a river stretch. Why do you need to do that? It's because we need to be sure that we can actually apply the criteria of the method in a meaningful way. So the requirements of homogeneous reaches is that the reach should be of a single type. So it should be either single thread or transitional or multi-thread, etc. The bankful width should be homogeneous within the homogeneous reach. And also there should be the incision should be homogeneous. And also the fish community, the fish target community, should also be homogeneous for the homogeneous reach. Member states who want to segment the rivers, they can do it in many different ways. Many have their own methods to do that, and that's all fine. This step here in our methods is just to make sure that they fulfill this basic criteria so the method can be applied. So for the Réverotte, France, they have a geomorphological segmentation method for the entire network. And the main criteria are listed there. I will not go too much into the details here, but they checked, and these reaches are all fulfilling these criteria that I just mentioned. And so the Réverotte river here is divided into 6 reaches, and each is between 1.4 and 3.8 kilometers. You can see them here on the map. So then, for each of these reaches, we're going to do the assessment whether there are barriers to either longitudinal or lateral connectivity. So first one is the longitudinal connectivity. So here we basically want to see whether or not there are barriers that are in the way of longitudinal connectivity. So if there are barriers that give a problem with longitudinal connectivity, it cannot be free-flowing. And so here we have some sub-steps. First, you have to see whether there are fish there in the reference where you expect fish there. And if the fish is there, then there cannot be any barriers that have a significant impact on the migration of this fish. So, because then you cannot call it free-flowing, of course. So if you fulfill this criteria, the absence of the barriers for fish migration, then it can be free-flowing. And the second part is whether there are any barriers for the bed load transport that have a significant impact. And then you also have to check whether the ecological flow is guaranteed all over the years, and whether there are hydrological alterations that determine physical disconnections over the year, and whether there are artificial impoundments in the homogeneous reach, because then you cannot consider it to be free-flowing. So here we go to the Réverotte again. In France, they have a national inventory of barriers. And in the Réverotte, here on the left side, they identified 4 barriers in this network, in this river stretch. And actually, those are bridges and things like that, and they are not considered really barriers for fish migration. But then when they talk to the river managers, then interestingly, they identified that there were actually barriers present that were not in the national database, but they are actually an issue for fish passage. So based on the local information, they found actually that there were a couple of barriers that were causing problems here. So those were the ones that are in orange and red here. And because of that, there are these issues here with longitudinal connectivity. The lesson here is that that if you even if you have like a national database, a large-scale database, you really have to look at the local conditions and the situation in the field and consult the people who actually know the river to know whether or not you have barriers or not. So if you take into account all these barriers, only this homogeneous reach number 4 has no barriers. And the other ones, they have longitudinal barriers. And the longest section that meets the longitudinal criteria is 5 kilometers. And this is this part from this blue one here to this green one here, I suppose. Okay, then we go to the lateral connectivity criteria here, because it becomes a little bit more complicated. Because there is much less information available in general of lateral barriers in terms of barrier inventories. And here, the approach that was chosen is that we are looking at the presence of lateral barriers in a corridor around the river channel. So it's not the whole floodplain, but it's a sort of a more limited corridor in the river. Why we're doing that? It's because we really need to keep this a little bit feasible and practical. And what we try to do is to agree on which width of river corridor you need to have without barriers or without too many barriers to allow the river to carry out its hydromorphological functionings. And this is based on sort of assessing the hydromorphological literature. So the width that we are looking here at is it's a multiplier of the bankful width. And so for single thread rivers, we're looking at twice the bankful width. For transitional 1, and for multi-thread rivers, it's only 0.5. So for braided and anabranching, because you have this, if you have braided and anabranching multiple channel rivers, you already sort of allow a lot of this functionality. And then what you do is you're going to map the barriers, the lateral barriers that are in this assessment sort of corridor. And then you are looking at the length of, firstly, the lateral barriers. So these are A and C on this one, the ones that are really the rip-rap and that kind of things. And the flood protection barriers that are all barriers, that are included in all barriers in your assessment corridor. And you look at the length of barriers that you have in this assessment corridor. And then what you do is that you compare the length of barriers with the total length of your river segment. And then we have these thresholds here that determine how many barriers are allowed to be a free-flowing river. And the ones that we are proposing here, this is still a proposal because it needs to be sort of better assessed what are the actual thresholds that we need, but it's 0.4 and 0.2 for for most of the river types, and for the meandering rivers, it's a bit less, it's 0.2 and 0.1. So we go to the river Rot here. Here we have the bankful width, that is 10 meters in this river. And then we've calculated this corridor of 20 meters on each side. And then they have mapped all the barriers that are available, that are present in this in this river. And in this case, it's mainly riprap, gabions. That is, those are sort of big stones in netting, and walls. They're mainly the attached barriers. And then if you look at the length, it was quite well possible to calculate these parameters here. It showed that for most of the homogeneous reaches, they met the criterion. Only the number 6, there were 5 ripraps that were quite long. It didn't meet the criteria for lateral connectivity. Conclusion here, all homogeneous reaches meet the lateral connectivity except homogeneous reach 6. So that's pretty good. Now we go to the large-scale assessment. Here we're looking at existing pressures up and downstream the homogeneous river reach, because you can have a very nice reach without any barriers, but if there is a huge dam upstream that stops all the sediment, or a huge dam downstream that stops all the fish, then you cannot really call it a free-flowing river. So here we're looking at existing pressures up and downstream of the homogeneous reach. Here we assess whether the main morphological and ecological functions that the free-flowing river has to maintain is not hindered by upstream and downstream pressures. Here on this, if you are considering this reach in blue here, then you're looking at the upstream part of the catchment, and you're looking here whether there is a big dam that is blocking the sediment, or here in this case where you have a lot of small weirs that are blocking the sediment. And so here we have criteria that are saying that if there is a significant impact on the bed load transport here in this reach, then it cannot be free flowing. For the downstream, we're looking at here you have to look whether you have migratory fish that are present in your homogeneous reach, and then the criterion is that all the downstream barriers need to be mitigated. So if you have dams downstream, if you have, for instance, a river where you expect salmon, and if the salmon is blocked downstream, then it cannot be free flowing. If there is a dam and the salmon is actually there are fish passes where the salmon can pass, then it's okay. We also have sort of discussed some exceptions here, because we need to keep this sort of feasible, and where for the time being it's not technically possible to mitigate, for instance, from the Iron Gate in the Danube, then it still can be acceptable. And also, where the WFD does not require to mitigate one or more of the downstream barriers because of the WFD sort of specific requirements, then also you can disregard it. And that's so here we go to the Reverot. This is not the best example for this, because here it shows that in this case it's not really a problem, because in the Reverot we don't have an upstream river section because it's already started at the source. So there is only a few tributaries with no barriers. So there's no issues with the sediment there. And for the downstream, partly also because of this temporary character of the river, there is no long distant migrators that are where the stretch is depending on. So also here is no analysis that's needed. And finally, we have the minimum length criterion that we have included. Here we sort of agreed on the minimum length that you need to support typical hydromorphological patterns based on the literature. And that's mostly sort of depending on the bankful width, with some minimum and sort of maximum length. And this is, as you can say, based on hydromorphological literature, we try to agree on which free-flowing river you would need at the minimum to have the repetition of typical hydromorphological patterns. And then we also have a minimum length for fish, and this is based on the minimum length to support sustainable population of typical fish species. And here we have a very simple proposal depending on the river size. So we go to the river Rot again. And here we have a 10 meter on average width, and then the minimum length would be 10 kilometers for fish and 1 kilometer for 1 kilometers. And none of the homogeneous reaches here individually would mean the minimum lengths, but the river as a whole would meet the criterion if there would be no barriers. But this is then a problem. So summarizing here the river Rot situation, I'm coming almost to the end now, is that it's possible to apply all these criteria, but it also shows some issues in the river Rot. It's not a free-flowing river at the moment because it has some issues with longitudinal connectivity in most of its reaches, even if they are not sort of in the national barrier inventory, but they are there, and they are a problem for the fish migration. So if you want to make it free-flowing, you have to do something about it. And then the only homogeneous reach that passes all the criteria, that's the one of 1.6 kilometers, number 4 here, it is too short, and that's also a problem. So you would really have to take out a couple of barriers here to have a sufficient length of free-flowing river to call it a free-flowing river according to these criteria. So the main action here would be to remove the longitudinal barriers to have the homogeneous reaches 1 to 5 meeting both all the criteria. In practice, this is difficult because they cannot be removed according to the manager because they protect roads and buildings. It shows that even if it's a river that looks pretty good, but it still has some issues. So we've the river Rot that I showed was only one of the case studies that we have brought together. And in the development of this methodology, we have developed several case studies, 2 from France and 1 from Germany, 1 from Poland, 2 from Italy, and 1 from Austria. And this shows that the method is in principle feasible, but not without problems, and also not without sort of issues with some specific river types, like multi-thread rivers. And the methodology as such seems to be feasible, but needs to be further developed. And for that, we need more case studies and also more case studies for specific river types. So what we're going to propose is to first sort of to consolidate the method that we have, and then to go into a testing round where we really are going to ask for many more case studies, and then we are going to test and fine-tune, especially the minimum length criteria and those multiplication factors and lateral connectivity criteria to make sure that the method is actually going to work for everybody. So the conclusion on the present state of this methodology is that it's a starting point to assess the potential for free-flowing rivers across EU member states. That the refinement is proposed within this year, focusing on, as I said, getting more case studies and doing a sensitivity analysis, especially in relation to those thresholds in the different steps. And this will allow the member states to demonstrate how removal of barriers will contribute to the free-flowing river target. And I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Wouter, for an excellent presentation, very clear, wonderful examples. If it's any indication, it's some of the fewest questions I've seen in a while, so maybe you've answered almost everything, but we do have 4 questions so far, and I invite anyone to continue, even as the answer question period continues, to submit any further questions. So I'll start with the first one. That actually was from Tom Bause in Deltares about the draft document on criteria for free-flowing rivers. Mark Morris provided a link, so if you're interested, please look at the chat for the link that Mark Morris put in there. Corina Georgiou asked a question for deltas. Should we use multi-thread braided anabranching or something else?
Well, I mean, they are terms that we've made a typology of rivers where we try to define very clearly those terms, and it's based on sort of the work that we've done before in the reform projects and other sort of scientific exercises that we're dealing with river hydromorphology. So I'm not sure I really understand the question here.
Corina, do you want to try to clarify?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for answering. So I was wondering, especially for Danube Delta, if we can apply this this methodology also for Delta, not because there are some different aspects.
For deltas, in principle, it should be applicable to deltas as well, although we will need to collect specific case studies to see how it works and to see if it needs to be further refined. At the moment, we don't have specific cases that we collected from deltas here, but we have case studies from branching rivers, and that shows that there are some specific issues there that make it more difficult, and it may need some sort of specific approaches there, but
can we propose Danube Delta as a case study?
yes, of course. I mean, that's the idea. I think what we are going to ask for is for countries really to try to apply it in different situations, and then see what works and what doesn't work, and then we will take it from there. Also for temporary rivers, this is also one of the river types where sometimes things are a bit different, and there also we want to collect more case studies and see if we need specific approaches there. So that's actually the plan to do that.
So the next question comes from Tom Bausier from Deltares regarding the fish criteria. Would a long-distance migratory species such as salmon disqualify an upstream tributary, for example, the Loire, to be free-flowing?
In principle, yes. So the approach here is that we took is that if you expect fish in a certain river stretch, then there shouldn't be migration barriers to that fish downstream. But we have these exceptions that are linked with what the water framework directive is actually requiring. So in the water framework directive, you have this concept of ecological potential, where you have if you have certain barriers, for instance, that you need for the use, then the question is, can it be mitigated? If it cannot be mitigated technically, then you can disregard it. That's the idea. I don't know the Loire situation very well, but for the Iron Gate in the Danube, that would be typically a sort of a barrier where that we cannot take out and we cannot mitigate it, and therefore you cannot require that to be taken into account, because then the consequence would be that everything above the Iron Gate would never become free-flowing. So here, the approach that we propose here is that you have to fulfill the requirements of the water framework directive in terms of mitigation. I hope it makes sense. It's all a bit technical, but we really want to link this sort of requirements with the ones of the water framework directive.
So can I step in, Jan, for a second?
Please.
Wouter, take you know the Rhine a bit. And the Ziek is an important river for the salmon to spawn. If the Germans make the Ziek completely free-flowing, but we in the Netherlands keep the barriers in the Rhine, would that then disqualify that the Germans can categorize the Ziek as a free-flowing river based on that the migratory fish like salmon and trout cannot reach it?
But the question first is then that is this mitigation required for you for the Water Framework Directive? Is it and if it is required, then it's then the Germans will have an argument to tell the Dutch you have to mitigate, and the Commission can go after the Dutch for the Water Framework Directive and say you are not reaching good status or good potential in this case. And but on the other hand, if you can make it plausible that is not possible, this disproportionately expensive, etc., to do that, then you can say, okay, then we are not requiring this continuity for this fish species.
Okay, so the next question comes from Celine. I believe that's Celine Hansen. Are these criteria for assessment available somewhere? This is not in the Strategy 2030 dam removal document. It might be explained, but not with the flow and formula, etc.
I think it's the link that was just shared in the chat. This is where we have the document where you can read these criteria. I think it was shared somewhere. Let me just check.
Yeah, from Mark Morris in the chat.
Wouter, I think it's only the guidance that is shared there, not
Okay.
not the criteria document.
Sorry, it's Mark here. Yeah, it's the guidance, it's the barrier removal for river restoration document that you referred to first. I don't think it has your flowcharts.
Yes,
That's
you're right. Yeah. So the document that I showed and with the flowchart, etc., it will be finalized and published within the next 2 months or so. And there is a draft now that is circulating for comments that many of you have seen, and it's not a secret, so it can be shared. It's not a problem, but that's the status at the moment.
I guess to follow on to this, Celine asks, are the case studies available publicly?
The case studies have been presented at a webinar in December, and they have been made available to the Water Framework Directive community, so to say. And so yes, they are shared as well, and they will be shared widely again when we are finalizing this methodology, which will be very soon in the next month or so, next 2 months.
So, one more question from Celine, which is quite similar to one from Amber Hancock. Could one propose case studies? If so, how? And Amber Hancock asks, are there any proposed case studies for the UK?
So what we are going what we're planning to do is to have a call for case studies to countries, but also I would very much like to involve and also encourage research projects such as Danube for All or MERLIN, if possible, to contribute what they have, and so that will be done in the second half of this year. And in principle, we want the case studies to be sort of a bit. We want as many as possible. The most important thing is that they follow the process that we are proposing. For the UK, yeah, it's always a bit sensitive, the UK, for the because you're not a member state, you're not sort of involved in this EcoStat slash EU policy circles anymore. But then on the other hand, if there are good case studies, that's more I think it would be really great to have them. But we are not involving the UK at the moment in the consultations, etc. But if through like stakeholder organizations or research projects, if they will contribute to this case study exercise, there is no need to limit it to EU member states. I think it's fine to get also UK case studies there. I would very much welcome it.
The next intervention, Andy Melcher put in the chat a publication from Nature Communications. Over 200,000 kilometers of free-flowing river habitat in Europe is altered due to impoundments. So if you're interested in that publication, it's in the chat. And finally, the last question so far we have from Tom Bause, how to motivate, MS, with heavily modified rivers and streams which probably cannot achieve the FFR objective. Would the summary table allow for some sort of grading of FFR achievement?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the thing is that we were asked to make a method to identify free-flowing rivers, with sort of our starting point was that free-flowing rivers are a very sort of ambitious objective that cannot be reached everywhere, and this is what we did. But of course, most restoration gains will be made in areas where you will not reach free-flowing rivers, but we want to improve ecosystem quality. We want to improve connectivity, and in my view, the kind of approach that we made it's a bit like a now what we have is like a one-out, all-out approach. So you have lots of criteria, and it's very easy to fail because there is always something that doesn't work. But you can also look at all these aspects separately, and you can see, like in the Reverot, you see lateral connectivity is great, but there is a problem with longitudinal connectivity, etc. And I would be very much in favor to sort of further develop this into something that is really you can apply everywhere and allows you to show actual progress. And I think it's a bit of a problem with this free-flowing river target that we have in the biodiversity strategy and now also in the restoration law, that it is it's a very ambitious target. While for the Water Framework Directive, we already have this targets to improve ecological status, including connectivity everywhere. And we need to show the progress there, and we need to motivate countries really to take the measures to improve things, even if it cannot become free-flowing. So this issue is very much on our mind, so to say, and I think we really need to get there. I mean, the easy answer is it's out of our mandate for this work, but that's not very satisfactory. I think we have to address it.
Agree, Wouter. Thank you very much.
So I just see one more question has appeared from Celine Hansen. I'll read it. Regarding new case studies, will the call be available to organizations that are not government administration? I work for a national park nonprofit and would really love to propose a case study.
Yes, I mean the process that we're going to follow there has not been yet sort of made, and most likely what we will do is that that we will continue this work in this EcoStat group that we have, and that we will make a call for case studies that goes out to the member states, and it goes to the stakeholder organizations that are represented, and then it should be possible, I think, also for anyone who is interested to contribute to do so, but we have to find the right way to organize that. But if you work for a national park in Belgium, it might be useful to discuss this with the Belgian river basin authorities that are also sort of involved in this European process. So it's a little bit sort of structured, but we will definitely try to find a way to be as inclusive as possible.
Okay, I see no questions coming. Remarkably, we are ending on the hour, unprecedented. So again, Wouter, thank you very, very much for a very clear presentation, excellent examples and details. I know I'd love to see the slideshow yet again. We always invite people with follow-up questions. If something occurs, we'll try to pass it on. I believe in 1 month we have another webinar coming up. Unfortunately, I don't have that information in front, but please look to the MERLIN website for announcements of the upcoming webinar. It's just been posted in the chat that if you want a recording of this webinar, go to the link that is made there. So I would only add finally that for someone with an Eastern European background, you made me a bit nervous when you started answering in principle, because in the Soviet radio, that's how they answered a lot of questions. In principle, yes. So, okay. So again, everyone, thanks very much. Excellent questions, excellent presentation. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.